Ashwanee, and I'm the Program Manager of the Masters in Human Rights and Democratization in Africa. My research areas are women's rights in Africa, and this is what we will be talking about today, especially like the protection of women's rights in Africa. So, women in Africa face several vulnerabilities, such as gender-based violence, harmful traditional practices in the form of female genital mutilation and child marriage, lack of access to resources, and patriarchy. At the international level, including at the African Union level, there have been several initiatives taken to ensure that women do not face those vulnerabilities. Those initiatives have been in the form of laws, in the form of policies, in the form of campaigns, but today our focus will be the Protocol on the Rights of Women in Africa, which sometimes are referred to as the Maputo Protocol or as the African Women's Protocol. Before coming to the African Women's Protocol, let's talk about the protection of women in Africa before the protocol. So the protocol was adopted in 2003, but before that there was the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, which was adopted in 1981, that provided for the protection of women's rights. Article 2 of that particular instrument provided for non-discrimination. And then there was Article 18.3 that provided that states shall ensure elimination of every discrimination against women and also ensure the protection of the rights of women as stipulated in international declarations and conventions. So this particular article referred the African Charter to the international, more specifically to the UN protection of women's rights. There was the ICCPR, the ICSCR, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which all, despite not being instruments that focused on women's rights, did provide for non-discrimination on the basis of sex when the particular convention was being implemented. Moreover, more specifically, there was the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women that the UN adopted. The African Commission on Human and People's Rights, which is one of the human rights institutions at the African Union level, made a decision on women's rights in Africa relying on the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. That decision was against Egypt, and it concerned sexual violence of women journalists in demonstrations. So in that particular case, the state had failed to address sexual violence against women because it did not punish the perpetrators of violence against women. The African Commission held that Egypt had violated its obligations in not doing so. So, as you can see, there was already a very good international protection for women's rights with the African Charter, the CEDAW, the ICCPR, the ICSCR. So the question that arises is, why was there a need for the Protocol on the Rights of Women in Africa? Was it not just duplication of legal texts that were available for the protection of women's rights? Now, before the adoption of the Protocol on the Rights of Women in Africa, there were several debates. Some were pros, some were cons, and those who were pro it said, like, even if there was the African Charter, there are issues that were particular to women's rights in Africa that were not covered by the African Charter or by the CEDAW, which is the human rights document for women's rights at the UN level. The reasons for the adoption of the protocol is that although there were already normative standards for women's rights in Africa, this particular protocol expands on the normative provisions for women's rights in Africa. It contains radical provisions that were not provided for by the CEDAW or the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. Some examples are, for instance, its Article 4 provides for the punishment of perpetrators of violence against women. It requires states to allocate budgetary resources to combat violence against women. This was the first legally binding document that provided for such obligations. Moreover, as I stated earlier in my presentation, female genital mutilation is one of the harmful traditional practices that has been affecting women all across Africa. Article 5, concerning harmful traditional practices, imposes an obligation on states to ensure that female genital mutilation is eliminated. Since the adoption of the Maputo Protocol in 2003, many states have embarked in campaigns to ensure that female genital mutilation is eradicated. And one such instance is the Gambia, which has criminalized female genital mutilation. One of the most creative and radical articles of the Maputo Protocol has been considered Article 14, which is on sexual and reproductive health rights. That article talks about the right of women to be informed of their partner's HIV status, the right of women to control their fertility, and moreover, the right of women to access medical abortion in specific cases. Moreover, it talks about the right of women in a marriage, and it provides that no child should be married below the age of 18. The African Commission on Human and People's Rights, which is the overseeing body of the Protocol on the Rights of Women in Africa, has adopted several general comments concerning the provisions of the protocol to guide states on the implementation of that particular article. Firstly, there were adoption of general comments under Article 14 of the protocol, and then recently, in 2017, there was the adoption of a general comment on child marriage. This was a general comment which is one of its kind because it was the first time that the African Commission adopted a joint general comment with the African Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of the Child. This was because child marriage is a concern of both the African Commission and the African Children's Committee. So the adoption of this general comment shows that the African Commission is willing to work with other institutions at the African Union level to ensure that vulnerabilities against women are eradicated. Another substantive provision of the Protocol on the Rights of Women in Africa that can be considered revolutionary is that it imposes an obligation on states to allocate budgetary resources to realize women's rights. If you look at other treaties, for instance, the African Charter or the CEDAW or any other treaty at the UN or at the EU level, there's no mention of the allocation of budgetary resources. You will see adoption of other measures, administrative measures, but this is a groundbreaking article because it makes specific reference to budgetary resources. As you can see, there are several provisions of the Maputo Protocol which, if implemented, will ensure that women in Africa face no vulnerabilities. However, the reality on the ground is that there is still a lot to be done for the implementation of the provisions of the Maputo Protocol, and there are challenges in its implementation. Firstly, there is a lack of political will. As at now, 40 African states have ratified the Protocol on the Rights of Women in Africa, with Tunisia being the latest country having ratified it. And even if states have ratified the protocol, they have not domesticated it. So even if they've shown their will to be bound by the provisions of the treaty, they've not taken any steps internally to ensure that the provisions of that particular protocol are implemented. So lack of political will is one of them. Secondly, even if the protocol provides for the allocation of budgetary resources, the reality is that many African countries are struggling with resources. Thirdly, there are weak gender national machineries. So even if the protocol has been adopted, it has been ratified and domesticated, states still find it difficult to coordinate the implementation of that particular document because they are weak machineries. The protocol contains some provisions that are not easily digested by many people in Africa. For instance, the article on sexual and reproductive rights, the article on child marriage, the article on the elimination of female genital mutilation, amongst others. And then women's participation is very low in many African countries. This is so because women have other stereotypical and traditional roles that they have to attend to. There's this concept that if women participate in, for instance, the political life of a country, they will not be able to give enough attention to their family. So women in that instance prefer to let participation in political life be an opportunity cost. And then there are many countries in Africa that are still in conflict. So in that particular instance, the state has other priorities to attend to and cannot really focus on women's rights. However, despite these challenges, one groundbreaking step for the advancement and the implementation of the Protocol on the Rights of Women in Africa is that recently the African Court on Human and People's Rights gave a decision against Mali concerning their family code that contained provisions that violated women's rights. This decision has been considered as a turning point for the implementation of women's rights. Firstly, it is the first time that any institution at the African Union level made a decision on the substantive provisions of the Protocol on the Rights of Women in Africa. So as one can see, there's scope for the implementation of the Protocol on the Rights of Women in Africa. And states have been encouraged to implement the provisions therein, but there's still a need to raise awareness about the protocol, and for civil society organizations specifically to use the protocol to ensure that women's rights across the continent are protected. There's also another mechanism in the form of the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Women in Africa that is responsible for the realization of women's rights in Africa. That mechanism has been very instrumental in furthering women's rights in Africa. The Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Women in Africa has spearheaded the process of the adoption of general comments and other guidelines relating to women's rights. Hence, it is recommended that the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Women in Africa continues her engagement with the protocol and encourage states to firstly ratify it, then to domesticate it, and then to adopt strategies to implement it.